Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex. Today I am joined by author and journalist Jonathan M. Katz. Jonathan is the author of The Big Truck That Went By, How the World Came to Save Haiti and Left Behind a Disaster, as well as the book we are discussing today, Gangsters of Capitalism, Smedley Butler, the Marines, and the Making and Breaking of America's Empire. Jonathan, thank you for joining me.
Hey, great to be here.
So this book is primarily or largely a biography of Smedley Butler, and you get to touch on a lot of issues in the course of going over his life. He is a super interesting figure to do a biography on because, one, he's inherently interesting because he's this prolific general who becomes something of an anti-war whistleblower late in his career, but also because his career is so long and storied, but it uniquely spans this time of like pretty underreported, underknown chapters in American foreign policy history. Like he does serve in World War I, but that is almost a footnote in his military career, it seems like. Everything else he's doing are these smaller, less known, and I don't necessarily want to say less savory. I mean, I think it's all pretty unsavory, but these are not the popular wars that he serves in. So just right off the bat, how did you come to be aware of his career and how did you come to write this book?
To answer the second part, it was precisely because I realized immediately as I looked into Smedley Butler's life that he was this figure that could be used to tell this much bigger story. You know, his military resume included a bunch of, it consisted almost entirely, as you said, of wars that even pretty well studied. You know, I was a history major and an American studies major in undergrad. Even in undergrad, I'd taken classes on and was pretty well versed in the unsavory parts, as you did say, of American foreign policy, you know, especially during the Cold War. But it wasn't until I became a foreign correspondent and moved to specifically the Dominican Republic and Haiti that I started learning more about the things that had happened at the beginning of the 20th century. And that's really where I encountered Smedley Butler. So when I was writing that first book that you mentioned, The Big Truck That Went By, about the earthquake in 2010, I wrote a chapter of that book that was a history of Haiti to explain how things had gotten so bad that a magnitude 7.0 earthquake became the deadliest earthquake ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere, which is what it was. And you can't talk about that without talking about the U.S. occupation of Haiti, that the U.S. invaded Haiti in 1915, occupied it for 19 years, and then in less formal ways, basically continued to control Haitian politics and policy for decades after, including arguably up to the present day. In a lot of ways. This is not to write Haitians out of their own story, but it's just to explain, you know, the ways in which American hegemony and American desires have manipulated and changed things and created the situation that exists on the ground there. And you can't talk about the U.S. occupation of Haiti without talking about Smedley Butler. So I actually encountered him. You know, people who know Smedley Butler, or people who've heard the name Smedley Butler in the United States, generally know him because of his later anti-war activism, his book War is a Racket, his whistleblowing on the business plot to overthrow Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which we could talk about. But I hadn't heard of any of those things for whatever reason. The first place that I encountered him was in Haiti, and it was only in doing sort of some background research at that point when I was trying to figure out, could this guy, you know, serve some sort of narrative purpose in that book that I was writing, The Big Truck, which ultimately, by the way, he didn't. He appears in a single endnote, but he doesn't appear in the book at all. That I realized that not only was he this key figure in Haiti, but he was a key figure in all these other occupations and invasions and interventions that the United States had been involved in the period. And that because of that, you know, late in life, come to Jesus moment that he had, Well, it wasn't one single moment, but that sort of degree of introspection that he brought to his life in the last decade of his life. I realized as a writer, you can't ask for a better vehicle. You can't ask for a better character to tell the larger story that I was hoping to tell.
Yeah, you described this really striking conversation with a Haitian who was asking why you were there, and you're talking about how you're writing this book about to expose Americans to this history that they're not familiar with. And he's like, "What do you mean Americans don't know this history? How could they not know? Because this obviously looms very large in, or I say obviously, you tell me. I assume this looms very large in like the Haitian collective memory." And it just is shocking. It was shocking to this gentleman that this is not known, and it's certainly not known. So you want to tell the story of that conversation a little bit more and talk about the U.S. role? Like, why were we there?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So it's interesting, actually, that scene in the book. It takes place, just so people know how this book is written. I traveled to all of the countries that Smedley Butler and his generation of Marines operated in, the places that we invaded, the places that we occupied. Because really, the book that I wrote, I mean, in a lot of ways, the subtitle is, Smedley Butler, the Marines and the Making and Breaking of America's Empire. Sometimes I think I should have changed it to, Smedley Butler, the Marines and the remembering and forgetting of America's empire, the memory of America's empire, because really, it is on the DL and often very much not so. It's really a book about historical memory. About the things that we remember, about the things that we don't, about the things other people remember, about the things that they don't, and the ways that those memories are shaped and manipulated, and the ways that the shaping and the manipulation of those memories changes us and the way that we approach the world today in the early, now getting to be somewhat early mid, I guess, 21st century. So that scene that you're talking about was actually, I believe, unless I'm forgetting something, it's the oldest scene that I'm involved in the book. It was the first piece of reporting that I did, really specifically for the book that became Gangsters. I was in Haiti, as I often am. So I lived in Haiti from 2007 to 2011, and then since then, I've gone down, on a fairly regular basis, either to visit friends or do reporting or just check in on the situation. I was touring an industrial park called Caracol Industrial Park, which was built in the north of Haiti. So this was the biggest single intervention in terms of dollars. I think it was 200, $300 million that the United States government poured into this industrial park in the north of Haiti. This is the largest single intervention that the United States government made in the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake. And it should be noted that the 2010 earthquake did not occur in the north of Haiti. It occurred in the south of Haiti, in the capital, Port-au-Prince. So this was away from the quake zone. But what the Americans wanted to do was we wanted to create a garment factory complex because Haiti in the 1970s and 1980s, at the end of the Duvalier dictatorship, the dictatorship of Baby Doc Duvalier, who succeeded his father, Papa Doc, Haiti was a major hub. Its role in the American-run, global economic system was as a manufacturer, really an assembler of cheap goods, especially clothing. Back then in the 70s and 80s, one of the headline examples that people often talk about is that at one point all of the baseballs used in the U.S. major leagues were sewn in Haiti. Cabbage Patch Kid clothes were sewn in Haiti. Disney toys, things like that. The Obama administration was in power at the time. It was really the Clintons. Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and her husband, Bill, the ex-president, really had the most powerful personal role in the reconstruction, the failed reconstruction from the 2010 earthquake. And what they really wanted to do is they wanted to get Haiti back to that. And the scene that you're talking about in the book, unbeknownst to the Clintons and the Americans who put together this garment factory, it was built on the footprint of a slave labor camp that the Marines had run during the U.S. occupation of Haiti. in the 19 teens up through the 1920s and the early 1930s.
The first occupation, right?
Exactly, yes. And it just so happened that one of the really heroes of Haitian resistance against the Americans, a guy named Charlemagne Perrault, who was assassinated by two Marines on Halloween night, 1919. His body was buried at that slave labor camp, a place called Post Chabert, which is now Caracol Industrial Park. And I snuck off the tour that I was getting from the South Korean garment manufacturer, who was showing me their very clean sweatshop that was nonetheless a sweatshop. And I went off and found the spot where Charlemagne Perrault had been buried. His body was disinterred when the U.S. occupation ended in 1934, but there's still a tumbled down concrete marker, which, at least as far as the workers there are concerned, that was the spot where Charlemagne Perrault's body was buried. And they were still sort of going by and sort of, raising, power salutes. And that was when I got myself in this conversation with one of the Haitian construction workers. I told him what I was thinking about doing, because at that point I hadn't really started the book project. I was like, he was basically like, "What are you doing here, man?" And I was like, "Well, this is all in Haitian Creole."
It's just a twinkle in your eye at this point.
Exactly. And I was like, I'm thinking about writing a book about American Empire and Smedley Butler and Charlemagne Perrault and the time that those guys lived, and to tell Americans who don't know about this stuff. And he says, what he actually said was, I don't believe that. How is it possible for Americans not to know these things? And that really is it was that conversation that really kind of set me on the path. And I was like, this is how I want to do this book. I want to go places. I want to talk to people. And I did want to do, and I did do, original historical research and original archival research. But in addition, I wanted to do the thing that I do, which is I'm a journalist. I go and I talk to people to understand what they remember, what they don't, what Americans remember and what we don't, and to put all those things in conversation with each other in a book.
It also makes it more relevant to the present, because you talk about contemporary issues when you kind of cut back and forth between the book and in the places that Smedley Butler was, and then you tell the story of your writing the book, which also bears on current events. It's a really cool way of writing it.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It was a struggle. Like, I'm not going to lie. Like, it was a hard thing to pull off. I'm pretty sure I pulled it off. It took a lot of editing and a lot of, just from a writing standpoint, the potential for the reader to just get completely lost in time. Where am I? Like, what's going on? Am I in 1915? Am I in 2017? What's happening was real, and that took a lot of wrangling. I think I got there.
I think you did. Can you back up? This is the first American intervention, but was it the case that the United States had anything to do with, even prior to this intervention, like something to do with the Haitian Revolution, or at least I know they were very concerned about it, and the Haitian Revolution kind of plays this boogeyman role in the Western Hemisphere in the countries that have slaves, because it's the example of a successful slave revolt.
Yeah, that's something I didn't really get it. I'm happy to geek out on it. I didn't really get a chance to dig into that in Gangsters. Yeah, so the U.S., for people who don't know, Haiti was a colony, a French colony called Saint-Domingue, and it was the richest sugar colony in the world. It was the richest colony in the French Empire. And basically in 1791, the people of Saint-Domingue rose up. It was a very, very complicated, very, very messy affair. It actually really started with the white colonists trying to achieve home rule or some degree of autonomy from France in the middle, which was at that point in the middle of the French Revolution. And it ends up being that because of the population dynamics and the sheer numbers, the vast majority of people in the colony of Saint-Domingue are enslaved Haitians, or now Haitians, enslaved Africans who rise up and end up overthrowing French rule and winning their own freedom. And the United States at that moment is the only other independent country in the Western Hemisphere, right? Because everything else in the Western Hemisphere is at that point colonized either by Britain, Spain, France, a
Portugal.
little bit the Netherlands, yeah, Portugal. And so, at various points during the Haitian Revolution, the headline version of the Haitian Revolution is that it was a revolution against France, but all of the major powers are involved. So Spain invades that portion of the island at one point. Britain invades Saint-Domingue at one point. Different people on the African side of the Haitian Revolution, what becomes the Haitian side of the Haitian Revolution, try allying with at various points, the Spanish against the British and the French, and the British against the Spanish and the French against the Spanish and the British. And Toussaint Louverture, who becomes obviously the ultimate leader of the Haitian Revolution, is a French officer. Sorry, go ahead.
Are these major imperial powers that are intervening here? Is their interest primarily just competition over colonial territory, or is there also this? They don't want to see this bad example set of a homegrown revolution, especially a slave one, or I'm sure some of both.
It's a mixture of both. So, I mean, at this point, Europe is descending into war. Over the course of the French Revolution, the French find themselves at war with Austria and Prussia and Britain and Spain, and allying with some of them against one another, etc. But very much, the British especially they're terrified of, especially once the slave revolt becomes sort of the major story of this revolution. They're terrified about this spreading to their colonies. Jamaica is right across a very narrow band of sea from Saint-Domingue, from Haiti, and they're really worried about the same thing happening on their watch. That actually is that's really what propels them to invade. So the United States is actually very kind of complicated, because the United States they're an independent republic. They actually, at various points along the way, are arming and allying with Toussaint Louverture and the rebelling slaves. This is under John Adams, who is he's an anti-slavery president. I wouldn't call him anti-racist. I wouldn't even call him necessarily abolitionist. He doesn't want immediate abolition. But there was some sympathy.
But he's a New England man.
He's a New Englander. And of course, Boston merchants get very well. They make a lot of money off the slave trade. But the Boston merchants are also they're also looking at an opportunity. They make a lot of money off of trade with Saint-Domingue, because it's this rich colony. They're anti-French. And so they're looking at this as an opportunity, like, well, maybe we can, instead of doing business with, the French, let's just do business with the Saint-Dominguois, like these African rebels who are trying to achieve home rule. That doesn't last for very long in the American context. So that is to say, and I don't talk about this at all in the book, just because, like, as you can already tell, these rabbit holes get really, really long.
Sure.
And I could go on about them.
And it's a good deal before the time frame we're talking about.
Exactly. But there is so the Marines intervene very briefly in Saint-Domingue during the Haitian Revolution, on the side of the revolutionaries, they're basically trying to keep British ships from carrying out a more extensive invasion of Saint-Domingue, which will interfere with the New England merchants' dreams of trading directly with Toussaint Louverture.
This is all pre-Monroe doctrine, but this is kind of like presaging that. They're like, get out of here. This is our area of influence.
But what ends up happening, is that in 1802, the French reinvade, because at this point, sort of, Toussaint Louverture has achieved some degree of autonomy. By the way, if I'm droning on too long about any of these things, just cut me off, because I'm just like, I just like hit these like folders in my brain, and it's just like open.
I love this. I'm very interested in this. Keep going.
Cool. So what ends up happening is Napoleon, who has now come to power as first consul in France, reinvades. He sends a huge expedition that's known as the Leclerc expedition, because it's headed by a guy named Leclerc, to basically reimpose direct French control, direct, Parisian control over this recalcitrant colony, and reimpose slavery. Because at this point, the Haitians have already won their freedom. Over the course of this revolution, and Napoleon's like, no, enough of that. And they also kidnap Toussaint Louverture. They arrest him. They take him back. He dies in a prison in the Alps. And Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who was one of Louverture's lieutenants, basically takes control of the army. He names it the Armée Indigène, the indigenous army, and he basically is the one who they reclaim. Speaking of historical memory, this idea of this place being called Haiti, which was a Taino word. So this is a word of the indigenous people who were essentially wiped out by Christopher Columbus and the Spanish.
Yeah.
In the 16th century.
There more or less is no native population of Haiti anymore. That's correct. It's all
pretty much. Yeah.
It's all Europeans and slaves brought over, and their descendants.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. It's been essentially a complete genocide. And Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who was himself, it is believed, born in Africa, he takes on this mantle of Haitianness. He says, he says, I have avenged America, is what he says once they defeat Napoleon and the Leclerc expedition. And it's at this point that Dessalines and his army, they undergo somewhat of an ethnic cleansing campaign. They basically root out all of the French nationals who are still on Saint-Domingue. This is sometimes wrongly remembered as a genocide of the whites. It was not an anti-white crusade. Whites who fought on the side of the Haitian Revolution, and there were many of them, especially a group of Poles who Napoleon brought on. Napoleon basically grabs a bunch of Polish soldiers, says, "You're coming with us in the Leclerc expedition." They get to Saint-Domingue and they're like, "We're on the wrong side." Like, we joined Napoleon's army to fight for liberty, because we see him as the embodiment of the French Revolution. We get to Saint-Domingue and they were like, the people who are fighting for freedom here are Black people. Like, we're going to fight alongside them. And they're all granted Haitian citizenship. And just without putting too fine a point on it, the Haitian Revolution has been this extraordinarily bloody and genocidal affair. I mean, Leclerc, who is the head of Napoleon's expedition, he says that the only way for them to put this revolution down is for them to kill everybody over the age of like 12. Because they're like, these people have too much of a taste of freedom in their mouths. Unless we get rid of them, we're never going to be able to bring this colony to heel. And they do. I mean, there are these horrific episodes of them just, General Rochambeau just grabbing, today we would call them Haitian men, Haitian revolutionaries, and women, and putting them in boats with flour sacks around their neck and drowning them all at sea. Just horrendous atrocities. And so it's in this context of atrocity that Jean-Jacques Dessalines and the Haitians, they do this sort of, kind of last atrocity. They're basically like, we will never be safe as long as we have French people in our colony. And they have a case that they can make for this. By this point, final independence is declared in 1804. And by this point, John Adams isn't president of the United States anymore. Thomas Jefferson is president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson is a slave owner. He owns a plantation, which I can actually kind of see from my window. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's just over that mountain over there. It's called Monticello. And he is terrified. Because he has been looking at in horror at the events going on in what he calls Saint-Domingue, and is terrified of that happening to him in his bed at Monticello, and he's terrified of what would happen if the enslaved Africans of the United States took their cues from the Haitians and tried to achieve their own independence and their own liberty. And even then, there's a little bit of negotiation that goes on, but sort of long story short, the United States refuses to recognize the independence of Haiti. No one recognizes it until basically the French, at gunpoint, imposes an indemnity. There was a series that was written about this in the New York Times earlier this year in 2022. Some people may have read about it, but it's known as the double debt because basically they say you're going to pay us ultimately 90 million gold francs. And then because you don't have the money to pay this, we are going to then impose an onerous series of loans on you. So you'll then owe us that to repay, to basically extort money on behalf of the French plantation owners, the French enslavers, to basically pay them back for the freedom that the Haitians had won at the cost of many of their own lives and in their own blood.
When was it paid back?
Ultimately, it is paid back. So the principal on this is paid back in the 1880s. But it ends up being the service on the debt ends up being finally paid back in 1947. So Haitian independence is achieved in 1804. The final services on this is paid back in 1947, and not incidentally to the book that we are actually talking about here. One of the major reason that the U.S. invades and Smedley Butler invades in 1915 is because those double debts, the debts that had been taken out from these French banks to pay back the French at gunpoint, in the late 19th century, those debts start getting transferred to American banks. So American banks start offering loans that can be used to pay back the French loans. So essentially, ultimately, this debt is transferred to the United States. And in the early 20th century, Haitian politics is in chaos, largely because of these horrendous debts and because of this exclusion and because of this inability to trade with the United States, with its most powerful neighbor. The United States only recognizes Haitian independence in 1862 as part of an act of war. It's because basically all of the Confederates, all of the Southern enslavers who had opposed recognizing Haitian independence and sovereignty up until this point, they're all busy, seceding. So now the North controls the Congress, and so they're like, well, as long as we're at it, we might as well recognize Haitian independence.
Why couldn't Haiti trade with the United States? Did we have like an embargo, a Cuba-style embargo back then?
Basically, yes. Jefferson imposes a kind of a formal embargo, a formal refusal to trade. And this kind of goes back and forth. But I mean, essentially, the United States throughout the years leading up to the Civil War, it's controlled by, what's known as the slave power. And trading with self-freed slaves is something that they're not interested in doing. And it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because in order to keep Haiti poor, these embargoes and these exclusions are meant to keep Haiti poor, and it works. And so Haiti does not develop, advanced industry. It does not develop a particularly robust export sector. It is more robust even in the 19th century than it ends up being in the 20th century.
Are they able to trade with other countries, or is there a similar concern and trade embargoes placed by like Latin American countries or other European powers?
It's similar. So there is some trade going on with Latin America, but again, this is the early 19th century, right? Now the early to mid 19th century. So it is much more onerous to transport goods back and forth to Europe. So there is some trade going on. The sugar industry, which is what made Haiti really rich in the first place, or what made Saint-Domingue really rich in the first place, never really gets reestablished. There's a coffee industry gets established, and there's some trade in Haitian coffee. But the other thing is that because of this debt that the French have taken out again at gunpoint. King Charles X, he has sailed gunboats into Haitian harbors and said basically either you sign on the dotted line and you work this deal out with me, or we're going to reinvade. We're gonna bombard you from the coast. Because of that, the French don't really have much of an incentive to trade because they're making all the money that they need just in ransom. Like the Haitian presidents are loading up ships full of money to send it to France. So they're getting plenty of money. They're getting plenty of money that way. And the things that Haiti has to offer, England can trade with its colonies and then former colonies, etc. So there's some things going on. I mean, I don't want to overstate the case. Like there is some trade, but Haiti just keeps getting poorer and poorer and poorer, and then ultimately its finances are in shambles. The French come in. Another Haitian president gives a French bank a charter to start a central bank. They start then skimming off the top there. And then as that bank starts getting reorganized in the early 20th century, American bankers get involved, especially Citibank, as still Citibank today. Then is known as the National City Bank of New York, but it was nicknamed Citibank even at the time. And they take out a partially controlling share in the central bank of the newly refounded Central Bank of Haiti in the early 20th century. And in 1914, the Marines, Smedley Butler's not among them, but the Marines come ashore and rob this central bank. They take out half of the gold reserves at this bank and bring them to Wall Street for safekeeping, to ensure as forced collateral, gunpoint collateral, to ensure the repayment of these debts. This sends Haitian politics once again into a tailspin. And the big thing that Haitian presidents, the big issue in Haitian politics at that moment, in 1914, and then what becomes 1915, is whether they're going to cut a deal with the Americans to give the Americans control of custom houses. So basically, the Americans have been doing this thing, and I talk about this a lot in Gangsters because the Americans have been doing this in other parts of Latin America, especially, taking control of import-export houses, right? So because you control customs, you then get to first of all, skim either officially or extra officially off the top, and it also
like tariffs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And essentially, they put countries in what is known as receivership. The model for this actually happens on the other side of Hispaniola in the Dominican Republic under President Teddy Roosevelt. But it's basically this idea of, traditionally up until this point, the idea of putting something in receivership, you would put a railroad in receivership, right? You would say that because the railroad doesn't have the money on hand, they don't have the cash reserves on hand to repay their debts for the loans that they've taken out. I, the bank, am going to take control of this railroad to basically make sure that the first, every ticket that gets sold, the first cut of that ticket goes to me as the bank to repay my debts. And then the second cut goes to, pay, the employees, and the third cut, gets whatever, right? And the last cut of all, if there's a last cut of all, is profit. So, what happens is the United States in this period starts taking control of countries by taking control of their customs houses to make sure that every time, a Haitian bag of coffee goes, out of a port and a tariff gets paid, the first, this starts with the Dominican Republic, with Nicaragua, et cetera.
It's like a wage garnish.
Exactly. So a Nicaraguan bag of coffee goes out of Nicaragua. First cut goes to the United States, right? A shipment of clothes, sewn in, whatever, in Spain comes to Nicaragua. There's a tariff. That all, first cut of that, as much as we want, goes to the United States.
Are these going directly to like the Treasury, or are these repaying and servicing the loans that like Citibank has taken over?
It's both. It depends on the specifics. Often it was the banks. But these banks are,
they're just an arm of like the State Department or something at this point, it seems like.
they're hand in glove. I mean, so it's sometimes it's hard to say, who's controlling who.
Yeah.
But it's what Bill Clinton would call a public-private partnership. These are known as controlling loans, right? The first of the controlling loans is to Honduras, J.P. Morgan. And it's actually at that point it's actually John Pierpont Morgan, but it's Morgan and Company, still around today, right? J.P. Morgan Chase. J.P. Morgan basically the United States comes in. They say, okay, we want to control Honduras. So what we're going to do is we're going to take over their financial system and we're going to issue a loan. And then under the pretext of them being now forced to pay back this loan, we are going to send the Marines. We're going to send force. We're going to send naval ships, or the threat of further invasion, and basically say, you need to pay back J.P. Morgan, right? And so what's happening these are all, this is a way of getting into the things that I'm talking about. These, this is basically chapters 8 through whatever it is 16 of the book. What's happened in 1914 is this has become the main issue in Haitian domestic politics. Are we going to turn our customs houses over to the Americans? Because the Americans are knocking on the door. They're like, do this. Like, you're in debt. We've got a great debt restructuring program for you, called J.G. Wentworth. We've got a great idea for you. Give us control of your customs houses, and we will restructure your way out of debt. And as anyone who's ever dealt with a predatory lender can tell you, read the fine print. But there were some Haitian politicians at the time that were like, look, we can't pay our bills. We are up to our eyeballs in debt to everyone, going back to this, revolutionary debt, this indemnity that the French imposed on us, coming out of our revolution in 1804. Maybe we can work something out. Maybe we can do this in a way that will enable us to keep a little bit of sovereignty, or maybe they can do it in a way that will let me personally, as the next president of Haiti, hold my head up high, or get a little money on the side, or whatever, right? And this is the main issue. Once the Marines staged this daring daylight bank robbery of the Haitian Central Bank, all of a sudden, a Haitian president is forced to resign out of shame for having sort of been in charge while this happened, and another Haitian president comes to power. And this Haitian president is somebody who's a little bit open to the idea of maybe we can work something out. Maybe we can do maybe you can. And they don't. And other Haitians don't like this, and so other Haitians start to foment against this president. Basically a force arises. The way Haitian politics works in these days is you have a president, and then you have the people who want to get rid of the president, and the people who want to get rid of the president raise an army basically in the north of Haiti to march on Port-au-Prince in the south. And one of these armies is moving toward Port-au-Prince, and this president rounds up people who he thinks are sympathetic to this force that's going to overthrow him, and he kills all of their children. Basically, he rounds them up, and he kills these young men. And because these young men are the sons of privilege, the sons of some of the most powerful people in the Haitian elite, they don't like this. So the Haitian elite, and they raise a mob. They basically kill the president, and literally rip him to pieces. And Woodrow Wilson is president of the United States at this moment, and he uses this moment as a pretext to stage a full outright invasion of Haiti in 1915. And just to let you know how much
I thought Woodrow Wilson kept us out of war. What am I missing?
He runs on that, right?
Yes.
He runs on that, but he's the only, then as now, really the only war that you can get Americans to pay attention to are wars in Europe.
Yes.
But so and of course he doesn't end up even keeping us out of that one, but that's a That's another chapter of the book. But anyway, all that is to say that, just to give you a sense of how much of a pretext this was, the invasion happens literally the day after the assassination because there's already a warship off the coast of Haiti. It's the USS Washington. They're ready to go.
And are there Marines in the country already too?
At this point? There are Marines on board the USS Washington.
Okay.
So when the USS Washington basically steams from Cap Haitien in the north, which is where that garment factory that I visited was, it goes down to Port-au-Prince, which is the capital, which is where the earthquake happened, and the Marines disembark again, and they take the capital. And then a larger invasion force sets out, and that larger invasion force is what includes Smedley Butler.
That was a great tour of Haiti and all of the seedy and interesting bits of history, and that takes up a good chunk of the book, and it's super interesting. But that's just one chapter in his career, and he spends a lot of time in Central America and Latin America in what's called like the Banana Wars, or if you've heard the term Banana Republic, like basically it seems like a lot of foreign interventions that maybe not more so, but at least more nakedly than other foreign interventions seem to just be being done at the behest of major business interests to make sure that their plantations and banking interests in these countries are safe and running smoothly. And I mean, I think that's probably true, of plenty of other military interventions, but it seems much more nakedly true in these cases.
Yeah.
But he's also in other places too. So he's involved in the Boxer Rebellion in China. Can we prioritize maybe talking a little bit about the Boxer Rebellion and his experience in China and the Veracruz incident? I think these are two things I'm really interested in talking about, whichever you want to hit first.
Yeah, we'll just take them in order. So the Boxer Rebellion happens first in chronologically. It happens in 1900. Basically, the Boxer Rebellion happens in China. Americans have been looking lustily at China, as has much of the Western world, for a long time. Just as today, people just look at a map, they see the population total of China, and they just think, man, if I could just sell, 1% of those people my cigarettes or my necktie or my app, I'll be rich. And that's an idea that never dies. It's still with us today, and it was with us back then. What happens is that a lot of American imperialism is really centered around the Pacific. Even these things that we're talking about in Haiti, in a lot of ways, it has to do a lot with the Pacific, because it was all about the Haitian intervention was all about trying to among other things, protect a sea lane to the Panama Canal. Which the Americans built. And that's another thing that Butler is involved in is severing Panama from Colombia for the purpose of that. And the purpose of the Panama Canal is it allows countries and navies that are mostly based in the Atlantic, as was the United States at the time, to travel quickly to the Pacific without having to go all the way down South America. And the point of getting to the Pacific is ultimately China. It's ultimately to get merchant ships and warships to be able to travel quickly and without harassment to this great imagined limitless market of China. So what happens in 1900 is it actually starts a couple of years before, but there has been imperialism in China going back to the Opium Wars of the early 19th century, in which some individual Americans have been involved. Political dynasties, a lot of the great fortunes are made basically in narco trafficking, smuggling opium into China, because that's, by the way, what the Opium Wars were about. It was about forcing. It was
about Britain forcing legalized opium trade in China, and
exactly.
It's ugly on all counts because it finally becoming illegal doesn't result in anything very pretty either.
Right. Exactly.
Anyway,
exactly.
Go on.
Yeah. So. But as a result of essentially the Opium Wars and other late 19th century wars and interventions on the part of a number of imperial powers, China is starting to get a little bit gobbled up along its Pacific coast. And there are missionaries in China's central plains, especially in Shandong and Shanxi province, and basically Chinese peasants, farmers, they go through, there's a horrendous drought and famine, and they blame it, both for real and also just sort of mystical and somewhat imagined reasons, on these foreign imperial incursions and interventions, because you've got these foreign missionaries in their midst, and they're going hungry, and you've got these weirdos with their weird religion, doing their thing in their weird language and God knows what.
And there's still, I think, on the part of China coming to terms with the idea that these powers in Britain aren't just backward barbarians, like they're a force to be reckoned with in a way that's really conflicting with their self-image of being like this great empire,
the Middle Kingdom. And so basically, a peasant rebellion breaks out against the missionaries, against the foreigners. And this is what's known as the Boxer Rebellion. It's called the Boxer Rebellion, by the way, because they're doing martial arts, but Westerners don't know what Kung Fu is. So they're like, oh, they're boxing. So they call them boxers.
Yeah.
And the imperial dynasty that runs China at the time, the Qing dynasty, they're also angry for many reasons about these imperial encroachments on their sovereignty and on their coast. And so even though at the beginning the Boxer Rebellion is somewhat against the Qing dynasty, they're able to sort of co-opt it and band with it. And so it ends up being basically a war against the foreigners, because the foreigners invade, right? So it's known as the 8-power Allied Army: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, Austro-Hungary, Japan, and the United States. This can still rattle them off. They in 1900 invade. Again, on the pretense, this is a word that comes up a lot when you're talking about imperialism, on the pretense of protecting their nationals, right? Because you've got these boxers, you've got these, fighters who really are, they're attacking foreigners, foreign missionaries. Actually, the main victims of them, even in Guangdong and Shanxi province, are Chinese Christians, Chinese people who have either been Christian for a long time or who have recently converted to Christianity. They're the ones who are really, bearing the brunt of this. But on the pretense of protecting the foreigners, this is an opportunity for them to finally achieve their dream of opening, basically, cracking open China's market, and grabbing it for themselves. And everybody wants in, and that this includes the United States. And Smedley Butler happens to be in the area because the other thing that's happened up to this point is that in the Spanish-American War, which is the thing that really kind of sets off this wave of American empire and Smedley Butler's career, Butler is first in Cuba at a little spot called Guantanamo Bay. He then goes to the Philippines, which is another Spanish colony, which the Americans fully colonized. And he and the Marines are based in the Philippines when this new invasion of China happens. So they're right there on hand. They just pop up right up the South China Sea. And they invade, and Smedley Butler and the Marines participate in this 8-power Allied forces, still known in China, to basically crush the Boxer Rebellion, to severely weaken the Qing government, the Qing dynasty, and in the process to achieve another indemnity. We were talking about indemnities in Haiti with France. There's another imperial indemnity in China. It's known as the Boxer Indemnity, which basically forces the Chinese government to make reparations. It's just ransom
for what the Boxers did to foreign nationals and property or whatever.
I mean, it's not calculated like that. It's just like it's just. I mean, it's almost a medieval form of war. It's just like we won the war, you pay us.
Yeah.
And this is a thing that happens it still happens to a certain extent today.
It's dressed up more today.
Yeah. Well, it ends up being somewhat discredited because of Versailles, because of the way that the reparations that are forced to be paid by the Germans,
that works out.
Yeah, it doesn't go well.
So, can you clarify? I think you said this, but the Boxers were primarily rebelling only against foreigners, or they were also upset at the Qing government?
There's a subtlety here, and you see this a lot in rebellions in monarchies. There is often you saw it, frankly, in even in the Haitian Revolution. Just to bring it back to that again, you get rebels who rebel against the sitting government, but they rebel in the name of sort of a greater loyalty to a true monarchy.
This is the case with, I think, like Al Qaeda and some
Yes.
modern Islamic groups like that are, they're very down on the local Arab tyrannies and stuff, but also, in the name of them bringing in foreign ideals and things like that.
Right, exactly. So you had like, I mean, I don't mean to keep bringing it back to Haiti, but it's an example that's out there. Like, so like at the beginning of the Haitian Revolution, when Toussaint Louverture and his fellow generals are when when the slaves are rebelling, they are saying that because this is happening during the French Revolution, they're rebelling against the French Republic in the name of loyalty to the deposed Louis XVI. Because there's no chance of Louis XVI actually coming back to power. But because they're like, well, we're loyal to him, we're loyal to the true king, we're going to gain our freedom this way, right? So you see a sort of a similar thing that happens during the Boxer Rebellion, where I'm just going to use the word Boxers for simplicity's sake. They didn't call themselves that; they call themselves the Yihatuan. But the Boxers are saying like, our like the governor of our province is a tyrant. We hate him. We are going to rebel against him, but we are doing so out of true loyalty to the emperor, right? And the way that they phrase this at the time is they say that they're going to revive the Qing, right? That the Qing dynasty has become weak. The Qing dynasty is corrupt. And we are going to restore the true Qing dynasty. Again, this is something that you see as a pretense a lot. And so the Qing are the Empress Dowager, who's the real power in China. There has been an attempt at a reform. I talk about this a little more in the book, but there's been an attempt at a reform in China. And the Empress Dowager wants nothing to do with it. So she actually orders the kidnapping of the emperor, who is her nephew, but has far less power than she does. And she wants to go, full on, autocracy, monarchy model again. And so she looks at this and she says, I can work with this. Like it's a little bit dicey because they're killing my ministers and they're like, they're saying that they're doing this out of loyalty to me, but they're actually like executing people who work for me, and they could end up executing me if they get too much power. But she kind of looks at the whole situation and she says, yeah, they're executing my ministers. But on the other hand, these Westerners and the Japanese are invading from the coast, and the people who are executing my ministers are also anti-foreigner, and they're also doing it in the name of trying to make my dynasty great again. I can work with this. And so she ends up sort of allying with them. It could have, all of these things in history, all of these things are they're all contingent.
It could have gone, you could picture it going either way.
Yeah. These are all messy. And I mean, this is the thing about history. And this is one of the things that makes history fascinating, and it makes all of these things that we're talking about so ripe for conversation, is that, none of it's inevitable. All of these things can go in lots of different directions. The ones that happen are just the ones that happen to be the ones that happened.
So what ultimately and centrally is likely the main reason why the U.S. is involved here? Just to protect any particular business interests, or just the fact that there are Americans there? Or
yeah, it's because this is the big goal. Because this goes back to Manifest Destiny. America has this conception of itself, and it's a conception that comes and goes. And at this moment that we're talking about, 1900, it is coming. That basically that the only way that America can be strong, and the only way that Americans and that American capitalism can stay solvent, is to constantly be growing. Right? I mean, this is still something we see today. You see it with Twitter, right? It's why the shareholders demanded, like, we have to keep growing. It's not enough that we're this big influential platform that has whatever it was, a 500 million users. We have to have more, because you always have to have more, because if you're not growing, you're dying. This is the way that Americans think, is the way that the capitalists think. And so the idea is, like, we need access to the world's biggest potential market. We need land. So we need to colonize the Philippines. We need to colonize these islands in the Caribbean, and we need to do all these things with a goal of extending our market reach, extending our market reach. And so there are specific businesses in 1900 that are interested in this. British American Tobacco, it's a big tobacco cigarette company based in North Carolina. Duke University, that's the Duke family. James Buchanan Duke was the head of the company at the time. Within a couple of years, it ends up being Standard Oil. The banks want to be doing business here. I mean, everybody looks at, still today, everyone looks at China as like, oh my God, there's so many people there. We can make so much money.
Yeah. So bigger picture, you have a crisis going on, and any plausible reason for the U.S. military to be there and to maybe expand our influence there is taken, because bigger picture, access to this gigantic and lucrative market is important. But it's not as if, I mean, I'm thinking, like, is it obvious to the United States that, the Boxer Rebellion going one way or another is going to be better for our influence or business interests? Or is it just, here's a reason to get involved to make sure that we have influence however things shake out?
Here's what they were really afraid of. What they were really afraid of, I think they had a sense that this thing was going to get crushed. Okay. I mean, you call it, racism, call it, whatever, like, but they were just sort of like, China's weak. They're done for. Like, they're going to be done. What they were really afraid of was that Britain and France and Germany and Japan and Russia, especially those guys, also Italy and Austria-Hungary, but those were slightly lesser players at the table at the time. They were really afraid that they were going to come in and that they were going to make bank. Because what American policy toward China at this moment is what is known, and some people might remember this from their high school history classes, as the open door. Right, the open door policy. What the Americans wanted at the time, because the Americans in 1900 didn't have any illusions that the Americans would be able to defeat, Britain, right, in a war, like, for over China, right? So they were afraid that the British were going to make China into a British colony, essentially. Right, that the British would do to China what the British had done to India, right? Or that the Russians, because Russia's right there on the border, right? The Russians would come in and they would just dominate half of China and become extremely wealthy. Or the Japan, which is this rising force on the other side of the Pacific from us. Japan they've already seized the island of Taiwan. They call it Formosa. And they're like, well, if Japan came in, and Japan, if they took over, then they would become too powerful and we wouldn't be able to compete against them. That's what the Americans are really afraid of. And they talk very openly about it. They talk about, that the eagles are coming to devour, the carcass of China. And that's really what they want. They aren't worried about China. They're worried about their rivals getting stuff that they think ultimately they're going to be able to profit from, and they're going to be able to ultimately use to enlarge American power.
I think we'll actually skip the Veracruz incident. You're going to have to buy the book. It's a great book. Read that. Yeah. But will you give a teaser? There's just too much red meat here to skip it entirely. Can you just give like a teaser about what the business plot is? This is too interesting to skip over entirely.
Yeah, and the thing is that all of these things, they sound all very different. And especially once you go down the rabbit holes, as we've been doing here, it sounds like, what the hell are they talking about? We're in Haiti, we're in China, we're now about to talk about a fascist coup to overthrow Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933 and 1934. But these things are all directly connected. So what I'm going to say is, I'll give you the very brief version of it. 1933, 1934, Franklin Delano Roosevelt has come to power as president of the United States. The United States is in the worst years of the Great Depression, and Roosevelt is starting the New Deal. That basically he's going to leverage the power of the United States government to help lift Americans out of poverty. A controversial concept in 1934, a controversial concept in 2022. Then, as now, wealthy capitalists look at this and they are like, oh my God, this is socialism. He's going to turn America into a Bolshevik country. He's going to turn it into a communist country. And essentially, a representative of one of the major banking houses or one of the major financial houses on Wall Street approaches Smedley Butler to oversee a coup. He's going to lead a column of 500,000 World War I veterans into Washington, D.C., armed to surround the White House, intimidate Franklin Roosevelt into either resigning or delegating all of his effective powers into the hands of a cabinet secretary who the coup plotters would name, and that this cabinet secretary, the Secretary of General Affairs, would then become effectively the chancellor of, and then the fascist dictator, the first fascist dictator of the United States. And just very briefly, just to explain like why Smedley Butler and why all these things fit together, it's because Smedley Butler had been doing things like this all over the world. He had been overthrowing democracies at the behest of very powerful American capitalists and bankers. And people who were afraid of too much self-rule, too much democracy, things that reminded them too much of socialism happening elsewhere. That's why they approach him. And I guess you got to read Gangsters of Capitalism to find out what happens next.
Yeah, exactly. Has there been any interest that you're aware of in turning this book into a movie or a docuseries or anything like that? I mean, just his life is so interesting.
I think it should be. I do. There's been a little bit of talk on the margins. One thing that happened over the course of the last year is that David O. Russell did a movie called Amsterdam, which I saw. Not a whole lot of other people did. And in the sort of B story, I would say spoilers, but it's not a great movie. I wouldn't even, don't even bother. But like the B story of that movie is the business plot. Essentially, I mean, it's a very screwed up, ahistorical, wrong version of it. And Robert De Niro plays essentially Smedley Butler. They gave him a fictitious name, but he's very overtly modeled on Smedley Butler. I on the one hand, maybe that's whetted some appetites. On the other hand, I worry that might have convinced people that this is a bad idea, since this movie didn't turn out great. But I think the real story, for my money personally, I think a limited series on Netflix or Hulu or HBO or whatever, Smedley Butler at Guantanamo, Smedley Butler in the Boxer Rebellion, Smedley Butler in Haiti, Smedley Butler in Veracruz, etc., and then do the business plot sort of I'd watch the hell out of that.
Perfect cat plot. And then he ends up writing his book, War is a Racket, and basically confessing to all these horrible crimes. One question about the business plot, because I understand it's, there is some controversy about just, how much evidence there is for its existence beyond Smedley Butler's testimony and, some circumstantial evidence, I think. But here's one question I have. They claimed there was going to be 500,000 troops. Is there, I mean, that's a lot of people. I assume they didn't all know about the plot, but someone was confident that they had 500,000 troops who would be willing to go along with something like this. Is there any corroborating evidence of that, of like who some of these troops or lower level people might have been, and if anyone else was aware?
All right, so here's how I'll answer the question. I have no doubt, and the congressional committee that Butler testified
they're pretty confident that it was mostly he was telling the truth, right?
Yeah, they had no doubt that he was telling the truth, and it's very plausible. The limited amount of corroborating evidence that they were able to look for, or that they allowed themselves to look for, corroborated up to the level that it was able to Butler's testimony. Basically, the guy who is the middleman who tries to recruit him testifies, and he denies parts of it, but essentially he confirms all of the relevant pieces of the story. Where he met, the places he was traveling in the meantime, even the things that they talked about. What we don't know is, we don't know how far along the planning for this had gotten. the names of the people who can be, sort of reasonably talked about as being sort of on the outskirts of this thing are members of what were known as the American Liberty League, which was essentially a interest group founded by Irene DuPont of DuPont Chemical Corporation, Alfred P. Sloan of General Motors, Al Smith and John W. Davis, who were two anti-New Deal former Democratic candidates for president of the United States, a number of other sort of big, figures in American business. And this middleman tells Butler that the American Liberty League was going to provide the financial backing for this thing. I lay out this case in the book. We don't know, however, like the extent to which, Irene DuPont had, actually said to somebody like, hey, let's this is a great idea, let's do a coup, or if he had been approached, or how far along the planning had gotten. It's possible that this was an extremely embryonic stage. It's also possible that, things were, who knows, maybe, almost ready to go. And then when Butler, testified, that it all fell apart. What I would say about, manpower, there were a lot of, soldiers, a lot of veterans, running around. I mean, there was a large deployment, suffice it to say, to World War I. At that point, it was just the World War, because the second one hadn't happened yet. And a lot of them were members of veterans organizations. And what gets talked about in Butler's testimony and in sort of the investigation that goes on around this coup is that the American Legion would be involved. And there's a lot of reason to think that the American Legion, so the American Legion is a major veterans organization, still is today. And there's a lot of reason to think that the American Legion would be sympathetic to this sort of thing. It's a very right-leaning, reactionary organization, especially at the time. Legionnaires were often involved in strike breaking. They were often, if the Communist Party of the United States would be out in the street, protesting against this or that, the American Legion would come out and crack their skulls. The American Legion looked up to fascists. They were big fans of Benito Mussolini. I talk about this in the book, but at their annual conventions, they would read an annual greeting from a fellow wounded veteran of the Great War, His Excellency, Signor Mussolini. They invited Mussolini to speak at the convention. I think it was in 1930. The idea that, and by the way, the guy who comes to try to recruit Smedley Butler, Gerald C. McGuire, is, in addition to being a bond salesman at this Wall Street financial institution, Grayson MP Murphy and Company, he's also a Legionnaire. He's also a member of the American Legion. He's a veteran of the war. He was a naval veteran. So, all of that is to say, it is conceivable that if things had, continued developing, and everybody sort of, turned their keys, that you could see an organization like the American Legion, which is already capable of, bringing Legionnaires out into the streets to, crush strikes, that they could say, come to Washington. What did Trump say? It'll be a wild time.
Something like that.
That something like that could happen. So who knows? And the last thing I'll say about it is that, that the reason why we don't know, whether it was the extent to which this was actually in the offing is because there wasn't a full investigation. The press laughed it off. And Congress, even though, there was this, brief investigation by the committee that actually ends up becoming the House American Un-Activities Committee, HUAC, it's a very brief and very cursory investigation that only lasts for a couple of weeks and there's no follow-up. So, as I say in the book, in the absence of a larger investigation, it's hard to say. But maybe that this, as they say in a scientific paper, those are avenues for future research.
Do you have any recommendations for books or authors or articles that you think would complement this work particularly well?
Oh, yeah. There's a great book that came out a year or two ago by a guy named Vincent Bevins called The Jakarta Method. It's about U.S.-sponsored anti-communist terror during the Cold War. But it talks about, it's in some ways it's kind of a sequel, even though it came out before, but it's about a later period of time. To Gangsters, because he talks about he talks about the ways in which through both formal and informal methods of control, the United States is using client states in places like Indonesia and Brazil, especially, to sort of carry out its dictates, and that builds on the things that I'm talking about, and then to take it all the way up to the present day. Another book by a friend of mine, which people may have heard of, called Reign of Terror, by Spencer Ackerman. That's about the war on terror. And that talks that, so ultimately it's about the exercise of American empire and of American power in the more recent decades. I definitely drew. I don't know if I drew on Reign of Terror, but I was definitely thinking about those things and Spencer's reporting when I was writing Gangsters. And if I didn't read it at the time, I've certainly read it, and it's a really great book.
I'll throw another one in there. I don't know if you've checked out Stephen Kinzer's book Overthrow. That just details like 13 different times the U.S. government has overthrown foreign governments from most of the last century and a little bit beyond.
Yeah, I've not met Kinzer in real life, but I encountered a lot of his books during my research. I think he's very much of a kindred spirit to me, to the things that I was interested in, and frankly, the things that Smedley Butler was interested in.
Yeah, I had him on the show a while back to talk about one of his newer books about the guy who ran MK Ultra in the CIA, because in writing a lot of these books, he's touching on a lot of CIA projects, and he stumbled on this particular character who's very underknown and kind of secretive, and wrote a biography of him. But I knew about him originally because I read Overthrow, and The True Flag is another great book by him that's kind of tells this story of a pivotal moment in U.S. foreign policy history, a kind of debate between a more non-interventionist, kind of pacifist vision of the American Republic and a more grandiose imperial vision, and mostly illustrated through this debate between Mark Twain representing the non-interventionist side and Teddy Roosevelt representing the imperial side.
Yeah, exactly. It's about historical contingency. And these, again, as we've been talking about throughout the conversation, like nothing is fated. Sometimes people have a tendency to look at history or to look at current events and say like, oh, we know what's going to happen. This is inevitable. And maybe on the scale of like the heat death of the universe, you can sort of make ultimate predictions like that to some extent. But in the interim term,
on the scale of years and decades,
things can go in wildly different directions.
So the two books you mentioned, as well as yours, I will put on the show notes page. I'll throw the ones by Kinzer I mentioned up there as well, but I'll put your recommendations. The Reign of Terror was by, you said, Spencer Ackerman?
Spencer Ackerman, and the Jakarta Method was by Vincent Bevins.
Okay, great. Do you have any upcoming projects you want to plug?
My main thing at the moment is my newsletter. It's called The Racket. Named for Smedley Butler's War is a Racket, among other things. You can find it at theracket.news. That's the main thing. Any further announcements, I will almost definitely be announcing on there. Not so much on Twitter. I think I'm starting to migrate away. Yeah.
Okay.
So the Racket. Yeah.
Well, that was my next question, is where can people find you? So I'll put a link to the Racket as well. You said that's, at some point I thought that was on Substack, but you moved away. It's your own website now? It's
still hosted by Substack. I just have my own URL.
Got it.
But yeah, and I'm social media wise, like I'm Katz on Earth on basically at any Instagram, TikTok, and that other site. I'm on all of them pretty much with that name. So you can find me.
I'll put that there as well, just in case you do decide to post something now and then.
Yeah.
My guest today has been author and journalist Jonathan M. Katz, and his book, once again, is Gangsters for Capitalism, Smedley Butler, the Marines, and the Making and Breaking of America's Empire. Jonathan, thank you once again for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.